Hello, thank you so much for joining me on The Same Drugs. I'm really looking forward to talking with you.
Thank you very much for having me on. I'm really looking forward to this as well.
So, as you know, but my audience probably won't know, we first met back in 2019 when you invited me to participate in a debate about whether or not trans activism negatively impacts women's rights, which I actually think to date you're the first person who's ever accomplished this because
Yes, I know. I don't know if that's ever happened again or at any other university in Canada or any other, I'm not sure.
I
But
don't think
certainly,
it's happened in Canada, and I mean, it's definitely not happened between me and anyone else, anywhere else in the world. And other people have tried to set up debates between me and trans activists or trans identified people. They've tried for, at least a couple of years now. And the problem has always been that no trans activist would debate me. So I suppose we should give some props to Julie Ray Goldstein, who
yes, no, that was
actually.
great. I like the whole thing was very good. And, there was a lot of heat in the room, obviously, but we managed to deal with a few attempts to derail the proceedings, and it continued. And it got posted on YouTube despite protests about it. And it can be viewed still today and hasn't been taken down. So I thought it was a great success.
And yeah, I mean, the fact that it even happened is amazing. But I mean, I think what's more amazing is that these kinds of debates aren't allowed to happen. And so I mean, we should explain who you are. You were an associate professor in the Department of Economics, Justice, and Policy Studies at Mount Royal University in Calgary, Alberta, until recently. And you organized that debate as part of the Rational Space Network's Critical Thinking series. Is that correct?
That's right. Yes. So I started the Rational Space Network in, I think it was about 2017. And then that year, 2018 and 2019, that was actually our best year, where we had a number of very, very good events. And yours, the one that you were involved in, was probably the most interesting. But there was also ones on Israel, Palestine, and is capitalism sustainable? Those kinds of questions. So there was a very good year, and we were sort of feeling, you know, things were maybe changing in the university system. So yeah, but things have kind of gone downhill. And it is to some extent involved with that event. Like that event had an impact on certain a certain faction in the university, and they became more totalitarian after that happened. That was one of the triggers for them to become more totalitarian, and it became impossible to discuss those kinds of questions at the university uh, shortly after that event took place.
I wonder if you can tell me a bit about the Rational Space Network and that critical thinking series. I mean, what was happening in the university that made you think that this was necessary to do this series? And this is, I guess it's, is the Rational Space Network a group or a university club or something?
Yeah, it's a loosely organized group. So there were a couple of people who were were very helpful in terms of organizing things. They were sort of the central, besides me, because I was the founder of it, but there was a couple of other faculty members who were intensely involved. And then there was about, five other people who were very interested, and then about, 10, 15 other people who were sort of on the outskirts. So we interacted, and we had a bit of an email list. And we would just kind of bring up issues to discuss. And then it became a little bit more organized with the critical thinking series. And the reason why we started that was because we could sense that it was becoming more difficult to talk about certain issues at the university, that we could sense that. We thought this would be a way of showing the path forward, providing the path forward, which would be, if you set up things properly, even in very emotional context, circumstances where people are very, very passionately attached to ideas and find it difficult to discuss them rationally. If you set up a structure that had people that were asking questions and showing people how to do this, that kind of, we would kind of become accustomed to that. That was sort of the idea. It was sort of like a modeling exercise for people to look at and say, okay, for example, trans activism, that's a very, very emotional issue with all sorts of people trying to stop people from speaking. We can do it here, and this is sort of, and I thought it was very successful in that way. It's just that this faction, which I call, like, people understand it sometimes as being wokeism, is often the word you use. Reified postmodernism is the words that James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose use. Identity politics that has become totalitarian is another way of identifying it. Anyway, this faction would see this as being hateful, discriminatory, harassing. To talk about those ideas was characterized in that way. So when you start to just to raise the idea, you're not even making any decisions about what the truth is or what should be done or anything like that. You're just raising the question. That is immediately, it's basically the position is that should not be a question that should be asked, that should be stopped. And that becomes an impossible, when that starts to take root, that sort of position, it's only a matter of time before, well, I'm the first to go. So I'm been fired. I was fired on December 20th after a long, starting in 2016. So things started to go off the rails a bit in 2016. They're sort of gradually, kind of working their way towards the end game, the final solution, which was I could no longer be tolerated in the university, because I would go to meetings and ask questions that people didn't like and thought should just not be asked. And this kind of created a situation where I was just not, it was not, people argued that it wasn't viable for me to be there. I still have the position, I'm fighting it through arbitration, but I've said I'm happy to continue. I don't see anything wrong. I'm teaching, everything's going well. I'm doing my research. I'm going to meetings and asking questions, and some people get annoyed, and they're entitled to get annoyed. But I'm entitled to ask the question. So what's the big deal? Like, I don't understand why I can't be in the university, but
yeah, I mean, it's weird because it's like so much of this trend stems from not even necessarily things that people are saying, not even necessarily people's opinions. Like, I want to get more into your arguments and perspectives on various issues, partly so that you can clarify some of the accusations that have been levied at you. But, it's often just about questions. Like, you're not allowed to ask the question. It doesn't even matter what your answer is. Like the debate around whether or not trans activism negatively impacts women's rights. I mean, it's a question, and what you're doing is great, really important, and exactly what should be done in a university, which is to allow people to think about this question and debate it. And hopefully through those kinds of debates and conversations, people come to a better understanding of the issues and maybe can form an opinion or change their opinion. Like, you would think that you would want in a university to be able to come up with the best arguments and perhaps the best solutions to problems or issues. and for sure to come at some level of truth, and certainly like via hearing from different kinds of people and different perspectives, and gaining more insight into various issues. What was it challenging for you to set up that debate? Was there pushback from the university?
Yeah, so it was very difficult, very, very difficult. It wasn't easy at all, because first of all, trying to get a trans activist was difficult, and I'm amazed that we did. Now that I look back on it, like at the time, I was just sort of seeing it as I just need to work through this and get it, talk to enough people, and finally it will come together. So that was kind of the essential aspect, because if we hadn't been able to do that, we would have been accused of kind of manufacturing the whole event, which was not the intent at all, and it wouldn't have worked very well, because we wouldn't have had that same kind of back and forth, and the ability for that position to be able to put forward. So not very long after I announced the event, and I actually sort of put out an open call to, everyone in the university, that if you would like to participate in this, like, we'd love to have someone, put forward the trans activist position. Anyway, so it turned out that, professors were kind of trying to undermine the event with students. So they were mobilizing the students against the event, which is it's a huge problem, because when the students start to be turned against you, then your life becomes very difficult at the university, because the students can start to complain, and they can start to give you negative evaluations. And this is all seen as being due to your not being a very good professor. So you're always kind of worried about that a little bit. And then on social media, there was this kind of undermining of my position, that I was somehow had some moral failings, which were making it that I wanted to ask this question and look at this. Like there's something slightly devious or malicious or something like that, or I didn't respect rights of people. I was wanted to deny the humanity of trans people, these kinds of accusations. And then when we did get the trans activist to come, despite there being a lot of attempts to kind of, impede that, then that sort of opened things up a bit, because now the people who are the in favor of trans activism felt that they needed to come to support the trans activists. So we actually got a certain amount of interaction was possible, which would not have been possible if that were the case. And then when we had the event, as you know, a group of students and a professor tried to have the cameras turned off. And then fortunately, one of my colleagues said, "Oh, I will go and stand in the back of the room so that you don't have to ask your question on camera." So that allowed that kind of, got past that tension. But despite them being in the back of the room, the people still went to the camera. So it was obviously just a histrionics to try to stop it from happening.
Yeah, like I just want to clarify for anybody listening, like they were saying they wanted the cameras off because they were, I think, saying essentially that it made them feel unsafe, because,
Yes.
If they're asking a question and that's on camera, then they're going to get targeted or something. But it came off as just an attempt to disrupt.
Yeah, well, they never went, like none of them went to the back of the room and not be on camera. They all went to the camera. So I was like, well, that was obviously not it was just an attempt to stop the filming so there wouldn't be a filmed event, which would have been terrible, because that video has had about, I think, 70,000 views the last time I saw it. So it's been a lot of interest in it.
Yeah, it's one of the most viewed videos still on my channel. And, as we said earlier, it's like one of the only times, if not the only time, that something like that has happened anywhere. So of course they wouldn't want it on record, I suppose.
It didn't. So, and then they organized a counter event immediately afterwards. Mm-hmm. That was to deal with the trauma that had occurred at this event, which I didn't think was a very good message to be giving to students, that hearing an idea with which you disagree is somehow traumatizing for you and so on. And it kind of, made myself and you and everyone else, like we were, orchestrating this terrible thing that was harming students. And then the Students Association went to the dean and tried to get the dean to ask me to not to post the video, even after that whole thing took place. We said, no, we're posting the video. We posted all our events. We're not going to not do it this time. So that was another kind of tension. So it got done and everything. But after the event, it was one of the things that caused all sorts of problems down the road with, trans people saying they weren't being respected at Mount Royal. And then a presentation that was kind of implying that the event had been a transphobic event. And it just continued until like I started to get into these. And it was part of my disciplinary situation is dealing with the trans kind of file, I guess, trying to raise questions and to some extent not take seriously this kind of hyper catastrophic emotional tone, which is, I don't think that's helpful to kind of sympathize with people who are obviously trying to ratchet up all the emotions. It's kind of a bit of an act, it seems to me, and to kind of go along with it makes the situation worse, because what we really need to say is, hello, this is a university and we discuss ideas at a university. You might find some of these ideas upsetting, but that's a problem that you're going to have to deal with. You can't expect everyone else to kind of, change everything that they're doing so that you don't get upset because you're listening to this idea. And that's kind of one of the problems that we're facing at the university.
Right, exactly. And I mean, you should come out of the university equipped to defend your arguments and to engage in debates with people and to, know how to have conversations that are rational and respectful and make coherent arguments. I mean, so in the Canadian media covered the fact that you were fired recently from Mount Royal. And they didn't mention anything about the trans issue, but there were lots of, claims of racism. So, there was, they mentioned this in the CBC article. They said they implied, in any case, I don't know that they overtly said, that you were fired because you'd criticized Black Lives Matters and Black Lives Matter, sorry, and also that you, what was the quote here? They said that you,
the residential schools. That was the other.
I said that you espoused the educational benefits of residential schools. So I wonder if you can tell me more about your views on these issues. I mean, what did you actually say about Black Lives Matter and residential schools?
Yes, so I was doing an interview for the Western Standard, and as one does on these interviews, you kind of say things a little bit off the cuff. And so I was for the Black Lives Matter situation, I was being somewhat hyperbolic. Anyway, I'd just gone through a few months of fighting against attempts to bring in mandatory anti-racism training for people, for staff, for professors. And this isn't about, dealing with racism when racism exists. This is something that should be fought against in the university. It's about these, what I consider to be these totalitarian types of impositions that were going to be happening. So that's what I was talking about when I said, quote unquote, destroyed, which, obviously, Mount Royal, I think it seriously undermined the academic, this kind of politicization and demanding that everyone accept a particular way of thinking about why, for example, Black people are underrepresented as professors. Like there's a number of different possibilities for that, but the Black Lives Matter position is that it's obviously discrimination and racism, which is causing that, and you have to accept that. And if you don't, you're a white supremacist and all this kind of things. And as well, I got into trouble because Wendy Mesley, the case of Wendy Mesley came about. And Wendy Mesley was basically had her career ended at the CBC because she referred to a book title which had a racial slur in the book title, but she wasn't directing a racial slur. She was just mentioning a book title. So I was going, this is crazy that Wendy Mesley, who's like a very distinguished journalist, was being basically career-ending situation because some people got upset about her using words and mentioning words in ways which everyone should understand, should be perfectly fine. So in my defending Wendy Mesley, I quoted some things that included this word, which I will, this is not something I'm going to give in on. I'm not going to refer to Pierre Valier's book title by another title. Anyway, so this group went after me for that and trying to get me fired for doing this. And so this was all part of this whole kind of dispute that was happening. So that was really what I was getting at with respect to that. And I was being called a racist and a white supremacist and so on, because I had defended Wendy Mesley in this way, which I thought was the principled thing to do, because I was thought to myself, Wendy Mesley didn't do anything wrong, so why should I not do the same thing that Wendy Mesley did? And I was explaining this to people, and they just would not. They just kept on saying, "No, you're a racist. You're a racist." I'm going, "Rrr." So that led me to be a little bit hyperbolic when I was talking about destruction, because a university where you can't refer to a book title is a university no longer. So that was the Black Lives Matter situation. And then with respect to the residential schools, which is my area of research, I'm working with a research group actually of about 10 people who have a variety of different perspectives. But one thing we do agree upon is that we don't perceive of the residential schools as being genocidal, because there was no intent to destroy a group like the genocide in the Holocaust or the Rwandan genocide. There were all sorts of problems with the residential schools. They were very insensitive. They didn't have the funding that was required. They were done by the churches, which had other problems that came with it, etc. But they were not genocidal. And there were a lot of problems that those schools had to deal with, which are not being recognized, which are that you had remote hunting and gathering groups that were not literate and had no formal educational system. So it was thought at the time that in order to properly school people in with literacy and those kinds of educational processes, you couldn't just have schools in communities, because then they'd go off on hunting parties, and by the time they came back, it would be 4 months later. So there was a lot of studies that went, one study in particular, the Davin report that occurred at the time. So they recommended the residential school model to kind of deal with this problem of nomadic hunters and gatherers that didn't have any traditions of literacy. And that resulted in taking children away from their communities, which, has had some major traumatic effects, obviously. But people at the time they didn't have the same kind of sensitivities. So this is sort of the thing that I was trying to talk about, is that I don't agree it's genocidal. I think there are problems, but at the same time, you had a lot of difficulties that existed that are not really being discussed. And many Indigenous leaders, not that long ago, probably 30 years ago, used to say things like, residential schools are really tough. It's really hard being away from home, but I was able to get a really good education in the residential schools. There's many, many Indigenous leaders who would say this. And now you're not allowed to say that anymore. And there's a lot of pressure on Indigenous people not to say that anymore, because you have to sort of, if you're going to go against kind of the dominant kind of view that's being put forward. So that's the kind of position that I had about it. And this was thought to be hateful and racist and anti-Indigenous and all sorts of these accusations. Like, It's
Yeah,
not.
I mean,
And
it's one. I mean, it's one of those things where there can be only one line on the issue, and I think that probably most of us in Canada are not experts on the residential school system, and we know that there were a lot of horrible things that happened in the residential schools, and a lot of those kids were abused, and it is really harsh and traumatic to be taken away from your family and from your community, and these kids lost their indigenous languages and things like that. But at the same time, I do think that it's worthwhile to talk about, like there's so much hyperbole around language these days, and it's not, like it's harmful, for example, to go around calling everyone a racist and a white supremacist if they're not in fact racist or white supremacist, because it causes those words to lose meaning and impact, just like it is harmful to go around using the word genocide or terrorist. For example, domestic terrorism is also being used these days in a hyperbolic way. Because people won't take it seriously when you do say it, because they'll be like, well, was it really a genocide? Was this really domestic terrorism? Was this really abuse? Was this really racism? Was this really white supremacy? And either way, I mean, people are free to disagree with what you're saying and bring forward information and facts and arguments, but it's the vilification and the silent thing and refusal to even let the discussion happen. That's troubling.
And to call someone a racist, or like an anti-Indigenous person, because you're saying, look, I think this is true. I could be wrong, and I can be corrected, but you can't expect me to bite my tongue and not what I say what I think is true. And it's not anti-Indigenous. Like, the truth is not anti-Indigenous. Like, there's no kind of policy proposal that I make. I'm not saying the residential schools were not genocidal, and therefore all Indigenous people should immediately not be allowed to do X, Y, and Z. It's just there were educational problems. The residential schools were trying to address some of those educational problems. They obviously had serious they didn't do things the way that we would do them today, in a much, better way, better funded, better educational kinds of people. But they were trying to sort through a whole bunch of things which were not really easy for anyone at that time. That's the other thing people have to keep in mind is, you had terrible scarcity in many areas with harsh conditions, and to kind of sort of think about things today where everyone's much more comfortable and doesn't have the same logistical problems is a huge mistake as well. And, I would get, like, because I was constantly being called all these, insulting kinds of terms, that I had ill intent. This was an indication of my attempts to speak the truth were an indication of ill intent. That was always what was being put forward. And that was kind of the difficulty, is that it wasn't like you're wrong and here's all the reasons why this is not true, what you're saying. It was, you're a bad person and you don't deserve to be here teaching students and have this space because you're making these arguments. That was basically what was being put forward, which I found to be highly anti-intellectual and destructive to the academic enterprise. And of course, everyone watching it, that's the other problem, is when you start to have that kind of level of animosity being leveled at you, everyone else who thought maybe there was something there in terms of an idea just backs away and doesn't want to engage with it anymore. So this group of very, very aggressive totalitarian identity politics people, they just take over the entire space and make it impossible for any kind of disputation to occur. And
yeah, so I mean, the impact is not only the silencing of the person who's trying to have the discussion or bring up the issues or do the research or what have you, but you're right. Like, it's that everybody else then feels scared to have the discussion or
Yes.
to ask questions or to support the person who's being targeted or, you know, the person who's being canceled, because they're like, if I even, you know, it's, you can't even, it's not even necessarily about defending what that person is saying. I mean, God forbid you do that, but it's
Yep.
about just saying, you know, this person has the right to say these things or to do this research or to host this event
Yep.
or to ask these questions. That means that you're signing on to whatever this person has said, and whatever this person has said has been deemed hate speech. And very few people actually bother to look into what
Yep.
the canceled person is saying.
Yep.
And I mean, so there was this student petition against you demanding that you be fired and accusing you of being racist. And it demanded that the university denounce you or denounce what you were saying. And
Yes.
I mean, the fact that the students are trying to have you fired for, you know, exercising your academic freedom is obviously wrong in my opinion, but I find that part interesting, where there's, you know, it's very common for these woke people, whatever you want to call them, to demand that their friends or that these institutions or, you know, that the government or whoever denounce the person that's being targeted, because I suppose if you don't denounce the person, then you're essentially treated as though you're signing on to these arguments. And I find that really quite creepy, again, because most people don't really know what the targeted person is actually saying. Like, so they're demanding that the university denounce you. I mean, and I suspect the university doesn't even understand your arguments around all of these issues.
Right.
I wonder, you know, did that petition have a major impact on your eventual firing?
Well, it was sort of a gradual process. So, you know, the environment has been being poisoned since 2016. It started to be poisoned, and it became like it started to accelerate. So it was part of the acceleration of it, and it made it more and more difficult for me to seem like it was legitimate for me to be there. Like, that's the difficulty. And then when people tried to get me fired, so I'd been defamed on social media for years, for 3 years, 3 or 4 years, and I didn't like this, and I was worried about it because I thought it would undermine me eventually. But I was in a quandary because I didn't want to stop people from speaking. So what I would do is I would just document this, and I would send periodically emails to administration saying, just letting you know that this is happening, and your policies are making that possible, which was the indigenization policy, which was what I was really taking issue with, because the indigenization policy was leading the university to have a position on
What's the indigenization policy? Was this
it's
specific to Mount Royal University?
yes, but
Okay.
it's going on throughout Canada, and I actually just published an edited volume with a bunch of different academics commenting on it, a volume called Indigenizing the University: Diverse Perspectives, which goes over a range of opinions about it, some in favor, a few, some critical, and some kind of ambivalent about it. But it has a whole bunch of different aspects. Some of them are not very, there's nothing wrong with them, like, renaming buildings and having Indigenous artwork and so on. That's, to give the Indigenous kind of cultural aspects sort of more involvement in the university. But the problems for me were, and the major criticisms that I had, which I think is the major aspect of indigenization, is that you were supposed to respect and value Indigenous ways of knowing. And Indigenous ways of knowing are often contain spiritual beliefs. And there's no problem studying spiritual beliefs, like you study Christianity or you study Islam, and study Indigenous spiritualism and so on. The problem is when the demand is that you must respect and value those as actual knowledge,
Right.
which as a scientists, you don't. It's like creationism. There's indigenous creationism, just like there's Christian creationism. You don't want creationism to become part of the science curriculum, and that sort of thing was starting to happen, and I was criticizing that, and then I'd get hit with, well, MRU has decided that indigenization is, indigenous ways of knowing has to be respected and valued, and you are opposing what is the official kind of policy. And this became like, it just opened me up for all these attacks from people. So I was telling Mount Royal, this is a problem, you should be aware of this, and so on. And this was all documented. And I thought in the end, when they came for me, I would be able to hold up all this documentation and say, this is what's been happening to me. So when I'm going to defend myself from this, that's why I'm doing what I'm doing, is I'm defending myself. But in the end, Mount Royal basically told me that I was not able to defend myself from these attacks. That my defending myself, me defending myself, was harassment of other people. So it's like,
Right.
this doesn't seem to be very fair. But this is kind of the problem with this wokeism and reified postmodernism, and you encounter this with trans activism stuff as well, is it's about this intersectional hierarchy. And if you're seen as being an oppressor of some kind, or more higher up on the oppression scale, you've just got to take whatever insults and threats and everything people lobby at you. And but if you try to defend yourself, then now you're punching down on the oppressed. So that's not allowed. So that's kind of what happened.
It's like, I mean, you're supposed to just listen, essentially. I feel like that's like one of these woke mantras, is it's like, listen to, whoever the oppressed group is. Like, I was always, this is totally irrelevant to this conversation in terms of the actual content of the issue debate, but I was always being told, when I was being critical of the sex industry, listen to sex workers, listen to sex workers. And I was like, I'm just supposed to like listen to what this person says because they identify in this way, and I can't think critically about it or question it, and I can't listen to what other people say who don't identify as sex workers but maybe were prostituted, or maybe they're researchers, or maybe they just have an informed opinion or whatever it is. It's the same thing. It's like, we have to, it's like, you're a white person, so you have to listen to Black people, or you're a man, so you have to listen to women, as though this is like a monolithic group in the first place. But what they actually mean is like, you're supposed to just accept this one particular perspective or like political viewpoint or activist mantra without questioning it. Because of course, all Black people and all Indigenous people and all women and all, prostituted people don't think all the same things and haven't had all the same experiences.
No, like, and then they disagree with one another. So why is this one particular perspective, which is disagreed with by other people of the same identity, why are we fixating on this? Like, Indigenous people who are critical of having prayers all the time at university, we're not going to listen to them. Like, we're just going to assume that they like to pray all the time, even though they could be an atheist. Like, why do we assume that an Indigenous person automatically is someone who likes to pray all the time? Like, that, to me, that was like, you guys are stereotyping people. You shouldn't be doing that. And we're a secular institution. We shouldn't have any kind of prayers. There shouldn't be Indigenous prayers or Christian prayers or whatever. If people want to pray, that's fine. That's up to them. They can organize their own prayers and so on, but don't bring the prayers into academic kinds of functions. So this was like a constant battle, and then being called anti-Indigenous and so on. So that's a major problem in the universities now, this kind of intersectional hierarchy, and you shut up because you are on the top of this and the people on the bottom. And of course, that's always shifting all the time. And that's what happened with feminists and the trans activists, is that the trans activists are claiming that they're more oppressed than women. So women better just shut up and not kind of question the trans activists, when, like, 5 minutes ago, it was sort of that kind of power ploy was being used by some feminist elements.
Against men, yeah.
It's like guys, like in a university, we can't have that. Like, that's not going to work, because in order to try to understand things, it can't be, oh, I can't question that because this is a particular type of individual whose views have to be seen as sacred and cannot be disputed in any way. That's going to be a disaster. And
well, yeah, and especially if you keep switching it. I mean, obviously, it's a fallible, approach, because it can just keep switching. Like if you're going to say it's like all women versus men, or it's like this color versus this other color. I mean, it's just not going to be true in all contexts, first of all, in all points in history. But you're right. It's like now it's trans-identified people or trans women. Trans women are more oppressed than women, so all women need to sit down and shut up and listen to what these males who identify as transgender say. I was reading an article about what happened to you in the Calgary Herald, and it was pretty strange because most of the article had nothing to do with you.
Yeah.
And it was, the article was supposed to be about what happened to you. And, it was talking about racism in the university, institutionalized racism in the university. And it said, this article reported that there were 4 faculty members who complained of racism at the university. And they said that there was this culture of fear. And it also said that 8 racialized staff members tendered their resignations in the past 8 months. Again, like they don't even say, I mean, it's sort of implied that this is connected to you, but they don't say how. Like, they don't offer any kind of evidence or even, quotes that demonstrate that these 4 or 8 faculty, these 4 faculty members or these 8 staff members were feeling somehow targeted just because you worked at the university. But I mean, that would be like a ridiculous claim to make anyway, especially because these people are claiming that there's systemic racism at Mount Royal University in Calgary, which I find sort of hard to believe, but who knows? But it's just like your existence. Like it sort of acts as though your words and your arguments are harassment, because it's not as though, as far as I understand it, you were actually going around harassing anybody at the university, never mind harassing racialized people. It's just that you're there. That's that's racism and that's harassment. And these people all had to quit their jobs because you existed there.
Yes. Well, asking questions is harassment. So that's, or like, this is what was claimed. People got other jobs that they wanted. So that's another thing. So like, someone goes and gets another job that they want and is better anyway than what, Mount Royal has. So they go off to another job. And this whole thing was people claiming that if you asked a question, so if someone has a perspective and you think that it is not very clear and it's got some dubious aspects, and you ask questions about it, that cannot be tolerated. Like that, and it's part of this the indigenization is where I really came up against it, because with the indigenization policy being developed, the attitude was, we've already decided this is correct, and therefore no question should be asked anymore about it. But that's not what happens in universities. What we decide upon today, we could revisit and decide that it's no longer valid. So it's got to be open. But the people who are part of this identity politics totalitarian kind of grouping, the reified postmodernist grouping, have this idea that there's the right answer, that they've found the right answer, and now everyone has just got to support that. And so if you go and ask questions, it's like, the earth has been declared to be round, And we have this flat earther showing up all the time to all our, meetings, asking questions about people, getting them to justify why the earth is round, when, this is a much more contentious, like, it hasn't been substantiated as to why this would be beneficial. And there's a whole bunch of issues that just got mowed over for political expediency. And then to try to kind of hold the university up to an academic standard, and high academic standard, is seen as being asking questions in a relentless way that is, and questions are being asked with ill intent and these sorts of things. So that's kind of what created this climate. And then when people tried to get me fired, what I did is, because I didn't want to complain about it to administration, because that's like going to daddy to stop. So I just started to satirize their attempts to get me fired. That's what I decided to do with my satirical character, Francis McGrath, which is modeled on Titania McGrath. So by satirizing,
was this on social media that you were doing this?
Yes. So I was satirizing their attempts to get me fired, which I wouldn't have done if they weren't trying to get me fired. I wouldn't have been, sort of doing this with respect to them. But because they were trying to get me fired, I thought, well, there's no big, I'm just calling myself what they're calling me. So, for example, they would call me a white supremacist and a epistemic terrorist and a hateful harasser and these kinds of things. And so I just call myself that and say, yes, Frances Widdowson should be fired. She's a epistemic terrorist and so on. But I was just repeating their words. I wasn't doing anything to them out of the blue, but because I was trying to defend myself in this way by just kind of taking a satirical approach, that was seen as being, unacceptable. So the whole thing has been totally botched by Mount Royal, which I hope when we go to arbitration, when all the documents I've documented everything since 2016. I have about 300 documents that are going to be made public when the case goes to arbitration. So I'm hoping that, all of this can come out and it can be discussed and we can sort of see where things went wrong in the university, because things have gone terribly wrong. And it was, in my view, because Mount Royal, instead of allowing the academic processes to take place of open inquiry and disputation, they made these they politicized the university and made this a policy that pretended that everyone was in agreement, which then created a very hostile environment for people trying to challenge what was being put forward. And that's kind of what's happened. That's kind of what has gradually just sort of taken over the university. So that's the difficulty. And I think that is all going to be, when it goes to arbitration, we can sort of see what happened with respect to all of all these interactions.
So when were you actually fired and what did they tell you?
December 20th, I was fired, which was another story, which is under massive grievances, massive grievances about that, how it was done. Very, very violent. It was violent. Let's just put it that way. And I don't use those words lightly. Anyway, they gave me this letter, this letter that has a whole, a huge laundry list of things, which has been a kind of progressive thing happening since November 2020, I guess, but and other things too. And many of the things are very vague, and other things are more, but it's all very kind of vague. Like you harassed people, students complained about you, members of the public complained about you, your social media activities, you yourself, you disrupted me. So the best one, in my view, just to give you an example, was it's claimed that I had disrupted a meeting so badly that they had to take away the chat function because I was out of control, that kind of thing. Anyway, the funny thing is that this was a claim that was made by a particular faculty member who I got investigated for this. But and so what happened at this meeting was I was asking questions, and this is what I do, is I go and I ask questions of these woke kinds of things that are happening. And I ask questions, and that makes people annoyed that I'm asking questions. So, and this one in particular was someone was saying that how were we going to change things at Mount Royal to make Indigenous scholars feel safe? And when I heard that, I thought, oh, I'm going to ask a question about this because I thought it was directed at me, that my presence was as like that article was saying and everything. So I said, what is it that is does criticizing indigenization make Indigenous scholars feel unsafe? Is that the problem? And that wasn't answered very well. And then later on in the meeting, I brought up something that I had actually been I've been accused of harassment because I had asked a question at an event which was about Indigenous star knowledge, incorporating that into science. And I was bringing up the point that post-telescope astronomy was very different than pre-telescope astronomy. So if you had cultures that didn't have a telescope, how was that going to be incorporated? Or were we just talking about studying like an anthropology course, studying how Indigenous people perceive the stars, which we do in other anthropological contexts? It was all perfectly fine. And the person who was giving the presentation wasn't offended or anything by this. So it was fine. But someone complained about this and said this was discriminatory and racist for me to be asking this question. So in the second part of the meeting, I came back again to this because I hadn't really received a satisfactory answer. And I was doing this perfectly, like I wasn't being hostile or anything. And I said, I just wanted some clarification on this because I have this book that's coming out, and Massimo Pigliucci, not me, I wasn't even saying it was about me. He's a skeptic, and he was saying that Indigenous science doesn't exist. That there's science and there's not science. As soon as you put an adjective of some ethnicity in front of science, it's not a universal anymore, and you're not talking about science. So I just mentioned this, and I was just asking, is this the kind of argument that makes Indigenous scholars feel unsafe at Mount Royal? Well, all these other faculty members got really irate and started, one said this was laughable and insulting that I was saying this. And so the chat, everyone's using the chat in this kind of like very ad hoc way. And so I just put in the chat 2 words with question marks: insulting, question mark, laughable, question mark, in the chat, which maybe I shouldn't have done that. I should have said point of order or something like that. But everyone was using the chat for all sorts of things. Anyway, all these other faculty members went crazy and started saying all these things in the chat. And then people said, oh, this is really negative, what, was being said. And then another person said, this is nonsense, what Frances is talking about. How dare she bring this up? So like they were like they were the ones who were taking over the chat and everything. I just put 2 words in the chat. Anyway, so I just said, look, I'm going to speak now. And this is what I'm talking about. Is that we're being told that we should be civil and we should be professional. I raise this perfectly valid point and I get attacked and everything like this that happened at this meeting. Anyway, when I was investigated for this, the investigator said that I did nothing wrong. It was fine. Like I wasn't the one to blame. It was these other people, because I had the recording of it and everything, and I had recorded everything. So there was no he said, she said about it. And then Mount Royal said that was one of the reasons why I got fired.
Weird. So
they're trying to push, the bottom line is they don't think that I am good for their you belong here brand. So a lot of administrators are involved in what's called brand management. They want to have a particular way in which Mount Royal is perceived.
They want it to seem inclusive to people, and they feel like your arguments make people feel excluded from the university.
By excluding me, things are more inclusive, because then certain people who are upset by what I'm saying won't feel unsafe. Whereas I'm saying everyone belongs at the university. The people who are arguing with me and want to get me fired, I don't think that's very good, but hey, I don't think they should get fired. I think we should just learn how to have conversations and so on. Let's talk about it more. So my saying we should all belong and should all be part of the conversation is seen as being exclusive, because I won't stop asking questions when everyone else thinks the answer has been found, and why should we have
that's how this sort of thing goes. Is like there are people who are accused of being exclusive for, like excluding people and not being inclusive, because essentially they're asking questions, or they're making unpopular arguments, or they're challenging woke mantras or what have you. And really those people don't seem to be excluding anybody at all. And in fact, they're the ones who are being excluded from the conversation or the institution, or being fired from their jobs, or ostracized from their communities, or whatever, kicked off of social media. So we've almost been here for an hour, so I do want to let you go soon. I know that it's getting late soon, but I mean, what's happening now? You say that this is going into arbitration, so I assume that you're fighting this. On what basis are you fighting this?
So the union, I belong to a faculty association, which fortunately is a very good faculty association. And so I've actually been, since I guess this whole thing started in November of 2020, all the disciplinary stuff started then. There were serious procedural problems that were occurring, which is not acceptable. Like if you're going to, and these policies are all what's called delegated governmental authority. So when things are delegated governmental authority, they have to occur according to the principles of natural justice and procedural fairness, which means that procedures have to be followed that are fair for both the complainant and the respondent. Anyway, this has been completely botched by Mount Royal, because it's a very autocratic institution and doesn't have the right processes in place. And right away, when that started to happen, all sorts of grievances, I started to file grievances about that. And so those were going already. And then when I got terminated, all the other grievances that are associated with all this stuff are getting included within this big package that is then going to be argued out at arbitration. So that's why, and also everything will be disclosed. So the arbiter has to disclose. Now, what people are saying is that what'll probably happen is that the university is going to come to you with some kind of settlement before this occurs, because they're not going to want to have all these things come out. And I'm saying, nope, this is this is gonna go the distance. I want to go to arbitration and have all these documents come out, and I want to write about this. I want to write a book. I'm going to write a book about this, and obviously I can't do things right now because I'm still uncertain about all the kinds of procedures and confidentiality stuff and whatnot. I don't know exactly. I know certainly I don't want to be talking about who people are that have done things and so on. But in the end, it's all going to be discussed and analyzed. And I think it's very, very important, because most professors haven't really seen in detail what a case like mine, and there's lots of them across the country. That's the other thing, is you never hear about them, because I'm a board member for the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship. I see a lot of cases that are not as bad as mine. Some are actually worse, but it never goes to arbitration. None of the documents come out, so no one can really see what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And my case is a very good one, because I've been ready for it for so long I've kept a record of everything in a very detailed way, so there's no kind of confusion as to what has happened or not happened. And like the really kind of terrible things that have gone on in terms of the destruction of the academic character of the university, the complete autocratic character of universities, which should not happen at all, because universities are publicly funded institutions. It's not like a private business, so that all has to come out. And so that's kind of the that's what I'm planning on doing. So I'm fortunately, although this is taking a lot of time to go through all this, it's not really time that's wasted, because it's all information and data that can be shaped to say, this is kind of the kind of process that's happened. This is the journey that I've kind of gone through over 13 years in this institution, really trying very hard from the very beginning. So I was hired in 2008, and it was a great institution. It was a fantastic institution with great academics. And then it just got destroyed in 13 years. It went from being a great institution with a whole bunch of promise. It was a college and was wanting to become a university. So it was very, very concerned about its academic kind of character. Mm-hmm. And then over 13 years, it got completely destroyed. And now it's just a shambles, because it allowed this activist element to seize control of the institution.
Yeah, and I mean that's what's happened in universities everywhere, it seems, and it all sort of seems like it began, and kind of, I guess, right after you started working at university, yeah. Like 2009, 2010.
Yeah.
I mean, I was at Simon Fraser University around that time, and that's when women's studies became gender sexuality and women's studies, and they started pushing the women part of women's studies out and focusing on the gender and the gender theory. Yeah. But in any case, I wonder, I mean, do you want your job back, or is it that?
Yes. Yeah, so that's the funny thing, is that people go, oh, you should just get out of there. I'm going, no, I don't have a problem. I'm happy to, I'm happy to return. Everything, as far as I was concerned, was going well. I had, cantankerous relationships with some people, but I have a great group of people that I work with. I was very actively involved with the faculty association. I don't mind asking questions and, having people, treat me with disdain. I'm used to that. So I've got a very thick skin. I've learned some things, and I think because of the way I responded to people trying to get me fired, people as well stopped defaming me on social media. So they defame me on social media, and then I defended myself. Then I got charged with harassment for doing so. But now that kind of dynamic on social media has kind of calmed down. So that's fine. I don't need to, that's what I kind of got it, is when I was tagging people on social media who were trying to get me fired, then it's but I don't have to mention, I'm not, I have my satirical stuff that I kind of find is interesting, but I don't need to do that really. I'm not, I was doing that for a particular purpose. So I'm perfectly happy to go back in there and try to restore the institution to its academic character. That's always been my sort of plan. Is I just kind of was amazed at how quickly it just became just unmanageable. Like for a long time, it was like in this, we're not getting along particularly well, but we were functioning. Like everyone realized the right of everyone else to exist. Like that was kind of part of it. Mm-hmm. But now with these totalitarians, they say you don't have a right to be here. You have to leave. And if the administration just stood up to that, then we would be able to function. But because they're trying to pander to these, well, there's kind of, and I've got a piece coming out in a couple of days about this. There's this strange, what I call an unholy alliance between the woke element, the reified postmodernists, the totalitarian identity politics, faculty members and students, and what's called the corporate university, the brand managers. And the brand managers like right now the totalitarians because the brand managers are autocratic in their intent, and they like the kind of arbitrariness of the woke element. But it's not going to be too long before the brand managers become annoyed with the woke people and say, you've gone too far and you're destroying our brand, and then those people are going to have the same kind of autocratic things deployed against them that they are currently trying to, encourage. So this is
I mean, this is the problem with people who say, like, we support free speech, but not if the free speech is, I mean, they'll say, not if the free speech is hate speech. The kinds of people who say, like, I support free speech now, but not without consequences. But what they mean actually is they don't support free speech. And in order to sort of manipulate their way into pretending that they support free speech when they don't is by labeling all the things that they don't like hate speech and saying, like, well, my speech should be protected because it's good speech, but this speech shouldn't be protected because it's bad, dangerous speech. And they seem not to realize that the tables can turn very quickly, and suddenly they can be on the wrong end of things in silence. So, but I want to ask you, I mean, how can people support you if they want to, support your fight? Is there anything that you would recommend people do?
Well, I have, well, there's kind of, I guess, writing to the university and so on. I'm on Facebook, so I have my Facebook. People can take a look at my Facebook page.
Is that just Francis Widdowson?
Yep, it's just pretty easy to figure out. The Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship is a very good organization which people really should join. It's only $25 a year, and it's the organization I'm a board member of, and it's very supportive of people like me. At some point, I might need to have a GoFundMe. Like I'm not doing. Right now the faculty association's been great. So if I lose at arbitration, which things are seriously wrong if that happens, then I've got to appeal to the courts. So that's going to be when I'm going to have the GoFundMe be. And as well, I have, all sorts of books that people can, buy those books if they think my views are interesting. Especially like the Indigenizing the University is a very accessible volume. My other books are quite academic on the separate but unequal and disrobing the Aboriginal industry. And I have a manuscript coming out shortly, which is the Woke Academy. So the things that we've been talking about today, the Woke Academy kind of traces how things have generally gone wrong. And what you were talking about, when women's studies became gender studies, like that's part of it, but it was actually much earlier, which is like starting in the 60s, that you started to get these departments which were not academic. They were activist in terms of their character. And that kind of sort of created this, set the stage for the later kinds of totalitarianism, which started to emerge.
But that does sound interesting, because I'm always trying to figure out where this all started. And I'll link to the books that you published down in the show notes when I put this up on YouTube. And I'll link to your Facebook page.
And I do have a website which I am developing. So what I'm planning on doing is kind of gradually releasing, because it's very complicated. My story is all sorts of things have happened. It's really difficult to get into, but I want to start releasing episodes so that people can kind of see a little bit some of the scenarios that have happened. Anyway, that website is called www.wokeacademy.info. And it hasn't yet. I still haven't. I have to get all the stuff together and get that figured out. But that's going to be in the future. Wokeacademy.info, which is going to have all the information about my case. So that's basically, I think, the best thing that people do. But certainly the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship. Anyone who's concerned about academic freedom, open inquiry in universities, www.safs.ca is the organization that really should be supported to help with that.
And the Society for Academic Freedom. Okay, well, thank you so much for talking with me about all this. I'm really sorry this happened to you, and I'm really grateful that you organized this debate back in 2019. I think it was really important. I'm really glad that it was filmed. I'm really glad that it's still on YouTube. And yeah, I mean, I always have a lot of respect for people who stand up and push back and say unpopular things and ask unpopular questions, even if they, turn out to be wrong. I mean, I'm not saying that you're wrong. I'm just saying, we should be taking risks in asking questions and thinking about things. That's what critical thinking is all about, right?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.